Hello and welcome to Western Insights. Today's show is brought to you by Western's College of Business and Economics in partnership with the Western Alumni Association and Foundation. Our intention with Western Insights is to extend our expertise far beyond the classroom with our own internal subject matter experts with external guests. Today, we're going to spend some time exploring the region's economy broadly and then turn our attention to the specific issues surrounding housing. These are hot topics that often get complicated, and we invite you to sit back today, get comfortable with that complexity. Ask questions today. Using that Q&A button you can find in your Zoom toolbar, let us know where you're looking for more information. Closed captioning is available for this event as well. You can find that in your Zoom toolbar as well with the closed captioning button. We begin today with our general economics discussion. To lead us in that, please welcome Dr. Hart Hodges, who is the co-director of Western's Center for Economic and Business Research and a member of our economics faculty. He received his PhD in economics in 1994 from the University of Washington. He joined the faculty at Western in the fall of 2000. His research interests include natural resource and environmental economics, health economics, and applied business economics. Hart is currently managing several research projects and public service efforts. Hart, I think we've got some great things to share with our audience today.
I'm looking forward to it, James. And I'll just jump right into that if you want me to.
Please do.
All right. So the title was Regional Economic Update, and I've somewhat dropped the regional. We'll talk about it for sure. But I think a lot of the main topics that we want to cover are really macro national in scope. I'll jump in with this particular slide, which shows employment in Washington State, and I just everything is scaled, so they're indexes, right? Each industry sector, from construction or healthcare to retail and so on, referenced back to February of 2020, right before the pandemic really started. What I'm trying to show here is the growth in several sectors like information technology, professional business services, very little in the way of a downturn with the pandemic. Not too surprising with Microsoft, Amazon, and so on doing really, really well through the early stages of the pandemic and continuing to do well. At the other end of the spectrum, leisure and hospitality taking a big hit, schools, education services taking a big hit. So overall, in the region, we're back to pre-pandemic levels, a little over in terms of total employment, perhaps not where we would have been, right, if we'd stayed on trend. But we still have some pretty interesting discrepancies across sectors. And that's maybe the first way to say everybody's going to feel the economy differently. This slide is also a reminder about going from national to regional. If you think about the state of Washington, you might want to ask, okay, if the nation is going up at a certain pace or down, what do Amazon, Microsoft, and some of the other large employers mean? Whatcom County, we've got a very stable economy with Western and Peace Health, and right, so we can pull back to the region whenever we want, but largely going to focus on bigger picture.
And Hart, the key point you made there about maybe this would look different without a pandemic, but we're getting back in a lot of sectors above where we were. I think that's an important takeaway.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit on some different slides. This one is a little busy with two graphics, but the one on the left shows the unemployment rate, how it was falling before the pandemic, spiked dramatically, and has slowly come back down. We're nationally below 4%, really similar, high threes in the greater Puget Sound area, little above that in the Northwest workforce area. And you can see employment, the blue line on that left picture, right? That sharp drop off when everything closed, rebound, not all of the way. And it's taking us some time to get back. Part of the story and the confusion is the economy, as it's recovering, had employers, businesses looking for workers, job openings increasing, right? Lots of people still out of the labor force, and we need to talk about where are those workers, what's going on, because we have a low unemployment rate, businesses looking for work, that's a sign that the economy is really doing well, right? You've got this tight labor market. And that's one story to be told, that the Federal Reserve can raise interest rates aggressively because the economy is still doing well. We've got other indicators that suggest something a little different, right?
For sure. And this slide here on the right hand side really calls into question, the sky's falling perspective that some people like to promote. It's, well, if there's plenty of jobs available, that changes the conversation a little bit.
And let's unpack that in a little bit, James, because we want
Yeah,
to talk about where are those openings and where are the workers, and what might happen to those openings in the coming months, right? We're already starting to see discussions about firms taking those off the table, if not also announcing some layoffs. So we especially first half of the year, right, with GDP declining a little bit in the first quarter and second quarter. And so until recently, when reports came out that the GDP grew in the third quarter, a lot of people were saying, we are already in recession because we had 2 consecutive quarters of decline in GDP.
that
But
is the definition, right? Two quarters of negative GDP. Is it that simple?
it's an old rule of thumb. The official group, National Bureau of Economic Research, points to a group that gets to call the start dates and end dates of recessions. And the reason I threw this little slide that you probably can't read on the left, they don't just look at GDP growth. The bars, all those vertical bars, are payroll employment, industrial production, consumer spending, and the like, all up through the first half of the year. So the National Bureau of Economic Research was not going to call a recession so far this year because the economy's been too strong and GDP was declining because of inventory buildups and some particular measures, not broad weakness. And the slide on the right shows non-farm employment changes each month. So you've got noticeable job growth each month recently. So again, hard to say we're in a recession, and I don't think the National Bureau of Economic Research would come close to saying we're in a recession or one's already started. But I think we got some housing experts to talk to, right? We might talk about recessions in particular sectors. So definitely want to get there. So national outlook. Yes, we still have to forecast the rest of this year, right? So I've got the current year that's almost over, but where are we going to end up? Modest growth. These numbers, James, come from the Washington State Economic Revenue Forecast Council, and they use a little bit of the Blue Chip Council numbers and some other pieces as input. No growth next year from a GDP perspective. Modest growth again in 2024. Unemployment rising. I'm gonna say that's a fairly fragile forecast, and we'll get into that, right? There's lots of things that could push unemployment up a little bit higher.
So Hart, if I was to be the voice for our audience, which so far is probably looking at these numbers going, I have not had enough coffee this morning to digest this. What's normal here? Like what should I be looking at when you tell me?
Normal is looking at a table of numbers and no, it's I think what you mean are what are some references? What should I expect of GDP, for example?
Right.
And let's just say 2%, right? And not too long ago, we used to say 3% was sort of a normal growth rate for the US economy. Demographic changes, changes in the growth of labor force and so on. Most people would say we're looking at lower growth rate numbers now. So let's just say 2% as a reference. Unemployment has been all over the map. We used to talk about natural rates of unemployment. Unemployment for something, right, as a reference. The hard ones here are the bottom two rows. Inflation. The Federal Reserve wants to get inflation back down closer to 2%, but there are different ways of measuring it. The Federal Reserve uses this PCE, personal consumption expenditures. Most of us look at the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and they look at the data on what people are paying for different things in different ways. Um, so it's some changes there, but I think James, 2% on the GDP. Will we get back to 2% on inflation? How far above 4% will we go on unemployment? Might be some ways to think about that.
All right.
So good questions. I think we're all trying our best to
I'm
figure
gonna,
out what's going to.
can I interrupt you one more time? Because we have
No.
we have a great question on your previous slide, and I think it bears going back. Can you go back? So the question is looking at the unemployment, is that at the end of the listed year? And so I think what's funny about unemployment rates is how they're calculated. But that is the number that's being projected for the end of year as the sum total of the year, correct? Or the average of the year?
Probably, well, you can do year average, but typically these things are going to be year end levels. So where will unemployment, that is a great question. Where will unemployment be at the end of this year? About where it is this forecast? Where will it be at the end of next year? And where will it be at the end of 2024? And the same on the inflation numbers, that we're still close to 8% on CPI headline, little over 6 on the PCE. Where will it be late 2023? Where will it be late 2024?
Unemployment's a funny one too, because I'll give you everyone flashbacks to 5th grade math, because this is where you learned fractions, right? Or when you get into college, we get fancy, we call them ratios. But as a fraction, when we look at unemployment, we look at the people that are in the labor force, not the general population. And so if people fall out of the labor force, we change the denominator as much as we change the numerator in that fraction. And so it makes these percentages not perhaps what you think they are.
And we've got a slide to talk a little bit more about that, because those people stepping out of the labor force is really important. But I think one of the first things that people have to think about on any outlook is a lot of us are grasping at straws a bit. And you're starting to ask, what do I think is going to happen with inflation? Which leads to the next question of, therefore, what do I think the Federal Reserve is going to do as it tries to push interest rates? So if you think inflation is going to be fairly modest, that we're near a peak and it's going to start coming down, then you might think, and this is the red line on the left, that the Federal Reserve is going to get interest rates up to about 4%, which is what we expect to happen today. On the federal funds rate, and then it gets to start a pause for much of 2023, and then start coming down. If that's true, GDP slows to about 0 this year, which was our outlook, and starts to grow in 2024 back up into 1.5, right, and then by 2025 we're back up into that 2% range, and that's where, James, you're back to your question about what's sort of normal, if you will. Now, if you think inflation is going to be more persistent, and we've got people in both camps, then the Federal Reserve has to raise interest rates more, which slows the economy more, likely pushes us into a contraction or a recession next year, and then it takes a while to come out of that. So this is really a bit of an argument on what happens with inflation, because that will dictate what the Federal Reserve does, which will dictate our baseline conversation for where the economy is ultimately going to go. And I want to poke some fun at my profession, because the slide on the left was our forecast for inflation early 2021. We thought inflation was going to come up just a tiny bit. Then we had to revise it later in 21, had to revise it again, had to revise it. We kept chasing with our forecast what we were seeing with inflation. And part of it was supply chain constraints pushing up the cost of, and that's on the right, cars, consumer electronics, things that had typically been going down in price and had really been pushing and keeping inflation muted, all of a sudden start spiking as we had all this money in our pockets and we go out to buy grills and outdoor furniture and so on and so forth, right? The expectation was that was going to taper off really quickly, so inflation could come back down, that it was transitory. Well, if you'll notice, the February of this year, we were expecting inflation to peak a little below 6%. Well, we blew past that. So this graphic was all wrong. And you have to ask, what were all these economists doing to get it so wrong? And part of it was we didn't expect another wave of COVID. We didn't expect severe lockdowns in China. We didn't expect an invasion in Ukraine. There was a lot of talk about, oh, there'll be some saber rattling, but there won't be an actual invasion. So we missed a lot of things. And we haven't gotten it right on where the workers. We're still got about 3 million workers out of the labor market, which means they aren't even looking for work. They aren't, and back to your point earlier, Jim, they aren't even counted in the calculations of unemployment.
Is it because they just don't want to work? I've seen that bumper sticker. They just don't want to work.
Maybe they don't. I'm not talking about the great resignation or quiet quitting or the old work to rules, right? These are people that have COVID or caring for somebody with COVID or scared of COVID, or who, after the great financial crisis, buckled down and saved enough and they were able to retire, right? So it's a lot of people out of the labor market. So part of the story here is we expected the same number of people to move back into the labor force fairly quickly as COVID subsided, and it hasn't happened that way. And part of it might be somebody steps away from work to take care of kids who are home, and they realize, you know, I was just covering the cost of childcare. We don't know exactly how many people are going to come back or how long it's going to take. We're in a giant experiment with hybrid work and so on. I don't want to spend much time on this slide. It shows the relationship between job openings on the left and unemployment rate in the past. And the point I want to make, the green, the yellow, the blue are all periods in the past. And they clump around a particular pattern. There was a fairly stable relationship between job openings and unemployment, right? And not surprisingly, as job openings moved up, unemployment moved down, and so on, just as you'd expect. Well, post-pandemic is the purplish at the top. The relationship between openings, businesses saying we have jobs, well, it's not moving the unemployment rate down the same. The relationships seem to be very different. There's more stiffness, more rigidity in the labor market. And that makes us have to worry about, does inflation become embedded because of this stiffness, rigidity in the labor market? So does the Federal Reserve have to push really hard on interest rates, even harder than they might have in the past, to deal with inflation? So backing up really quickly, the five sort of column areas are different age groups. The different shades of blue and the red are different income groups. These are men working. And the story, though, is how much do people move for work? We've always had a history in the United States of people moving for work, and our mobility has been declining steadily. This is even pre-pandemic. We used to talk about people going to the place where they can get the best job. In the old days, you might say going to Detroit or Gary, Indiana or something, or moving to New York or move. We don't move as much as we used to, and it's gotten even worse with COVID. We'll see what the panelists say in just a little bit about housing lock with mortgage rates or affordability in general, right? We want to think about what's happening with mobility, because maybe the job openings today are there, but I can't move to get that job for a variety of reasons.
What's been fascinating to me is the mobility data in the Seattle market, which, you know, everyone's moving out of Seattle. And when you dug into the data, they were moving from the city proper to places like Bothell and Woodinville and Renton, and they weren't moving. Majority of people, overwhelming majority, weren't moving out of the region area. They were just moving to make a different housing selection. They, you know, so mobility has definitely been tweaked.
Yeah, and I might be able to move away with hybrid work, but I'm still tethered to that job. I'm willing to take a longer commute if it's only 2 days a week or something, and I want more space. No, there's a lot going on, and a lot of it tied to housing. So I'm looking forward to that panel in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
We also have to keep in mind that we're going to see a lot of changes in the data, just because we've had just unbelievable amounts of money pushed into the economy. And as that starts to fade, or as we stop buying outdoor furniture and start buying again, I don't know, concert tickets, the changes, we're going to see contractions in some area. But I really want to highlight what happened to the stimulus money. Well, on the left is supposed to show the relative magnitude of the money pushed in. What happened to income, personal income, this giant spike. And the bars on the right show excess savings. I mean, that the move up in checking accounts and savings accounts was shocking. Maybe not surprisingly, if you really start thinking about it, PPP money went to business owners. Once the stimulus checks got spent, right, it's been collecting in the upper half of the income spectrum, not the lower half.
People forget that there was a lot of flavors of stimulus, right? I mean, you talked about PPP. I mean, most people think of, well, I got that check in the mail, and or I got those checks in the mail. That was actually a fairly small percentage of, on a per capita basis, a pretty small percentage of the stimulus that went out. And so this where it got deposited and where it resides still in the economy is
and part of the reason I want to put this up is I'm guessing that the panelists coming up are going to talk a little bit about housing markets where people have a lot of money to buy housing, and housing markets where people, right, who's active in the market, where are incomes high, you know, there's this income range is going to be an important point, and a lot of money moved in. And so a lot of the housing prices spikes that we were seeing was partly because, hey, I can afford a lot, and that's changing.
You know, back to your recession comment earlier, perhaps it's a recession for who that becomes the question.
I think I don't think we ought to talk about the economy or a recession. Right? You know, some people are going to feel this all really differently. Speaking of that, James,
hey, you're handicapping it. This is good.
Yeah,
I put $10 on. Oh.
Well, you sent me the top graph, which was from the Wall Street Journal survey, suggesting that probability of a recession in the next 12 months is about 60, a little over 60%. So I found the one from the Conference Board saying 96. I wanted to get the bigger number in here, but you know, let's have some fun, because truth, I can find really well-known economists that tell me big recession, almost certain, no recession, recession likely, and it's going to be mild, all over the map. And part of the problem is the data is all over the map.
Which makes it hard for people to decide what to do or what to think or how to feel even about when you say the economy. Or
I think we're going to almost have sort of rolling recessions in different sectors, and people in different income levels are going to feel things very, very differently, right? I mean, if you saw the savings in that last slide, if we have a mild recession, half the folks got so much savings it's almost an I don't care. But right. That's not true for everybody. So another thing I want to set the stage for the folks coming up, interest rates. And this shows the federal funds rate, which is just the short-term rate that the Fed can really manage. And I didn't go back far enough. I just wanted to go far enough in this slide to show that where we are today at 3 to 3.25, probably 4 by the time we get done with this talk, because the Fed is meeting.
Right.
4 is not a high number historically. I mean, it is over the last decade.
That's the funny part about this, though, right?
What's that?
That's the funny part about this data set.
What I want to highlight is the rate of increase. Right, we've gone from 0 to 4 awfully fast. And where's the adjustment period, right? I mean, if I was planning to be able to borrow next year at close to 0, and boom, now I can't buy it. That's hard. So it's disruptive to have that sort of change that fast, even though a lot of people in the audience can probably remember when interest rates were a lot higher. We're talking about mortgage rates at 7% now. And you and I were laughing recently. I remember when people were really excited that mortgage rates had come back down to 7% because that was so low. So it is, but the rate of increase right now and the comparison to zero for so long is hard. All right, just a couple more slides to really set the stage for the panelists. Don't have time to talk about some of the risks and the things that we really should talk about. The bond market is under a lot of stress right now. We could get into that. I'm not going to say China has its own version of the subprime crisis, but China has some issues in real estate, and we don't know what that's actually going to mean for anybody else. We're talking about friendshoring and realignment of supply chains. That's not going to be cheap. Transition to clean energy, investments in the grid that are necessary, that's not going to be cheap. Who knows how long things last in Ukraine? Hopefully not long, but then you can turn your attention to, you can pick your favorite part of the world. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't say, we've been talking about outlooks for a year or two. If we look farther down the road, there are some big picture problems or issues that need attention. That when I think of climate and I look at the drought that's been going on for so long, and how we move water, where we move water, food. The inflation in food right now is a fascinating topic that I don't think we get to stop talking about. It's not just a supply chain issue. It's not just a COVID issue. It's bigger. So I would love to dig into those things, but back to interest rates and housing, right? Because that sharp rise in interest rates is hard on housing, again, because if I'm trying to build a house, I'm looking months and months and months, years out. If I've got a development project and I've got a plan, that rapid change in interest rates is hard. So you can see the sharp drop in the housing index just over the course of this year. And the other thing I want to say for housing, is how much have we been building? And this slide only points at single family. We need to talk multifamily, not just single family, but we used to build at a certain rate, if you will. And then we had the financial crisis, the housing bust in 08, 09. The construction sector has never gotten to the same size it was. And the rate at which we build houses has never gotten back to what it was. So there's a supply side story that I think our panelists are going to talk about. So I just wanted to put a graphic up so everybody in the audience gets a feel for the slow growth in supply and housing over the last decade plus. So with that, James.
Yeah, no, we'll leave the slide up here. People can email later if they want to, and we'll send this out by email as well, and then we'll get this off your screen so you can get a bigger picture of Hart on your screen, because that's what everyone signed up for today. I got a couple questions here, Hart. So we got a couple of minutes before our panelists will start getting pushy in the back room here and want to get out here and share their stuff. So absent significant Fed meddling, I love that terminology, by the way, David. That's a funny way to say that. Is there some natural, organic, economically evolutionary interest rate that both provides savers with an incentivizing real return while keeping the economy humming along? So is there a sweet spot when it comes to interest rates, Hart? I mean,
I get to be the classic economist to say on the one hand and the other in this one, but for good reason, because the answer is partly yes, in that we talk about a natural rate. The no is, I need to know a little bit about inflation to be able to give a good answer. And part of the debate is, do we think inflation is going to come back down to that 2% level so that we can be talking about a natural rate close to 3%, say, for 10-year treasuries or something, in that sweet spot where absent the meddling things might tend? Or are we entering a regime where, because of the supply chain adjustments and the clean energy adjustments, or even climate, that we're talking about a higher inflation rate era, and the natural rate, absent the meddling, would be higher? I mean, so the question is great because that is a really important debate going on in economics right now.
So the last question I'm gonna pose here before we move forward has to do with immigration. So how do we think that immigration reform could impact employment rates in many sectors, and specifically, of course, construction and manufacturing? And I mean, the data for immigration has been we've seen a very low immigration rate for the last handful of years, right?
Well, I mean, go back to your first comment. What should we expect with GDP? Well, we've always been able to assume a certain growth rate in the labor force, which is partly the driver for the broader growth, right? We've got a little bit slower growth on the demographic side, but immigration plays into that because we've always had immigration policy that allows some employment growth on the construction side, but also the tech industry sectors, right? And immigration is low right now. And that suggests, to the extent that we stick with that, that suggests slower growth.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, keep asking questions, folks in the audience. We're gonna move ahead here. But I think having this larger context chart is going to help everyone dive into this deeper into the pool when we think specifically about housing, because your comments about needing to get specifics about industries and needing to get specifics about different types of people and how things are going to impact people, and we can't think of just one economy, one whatever.
Right now, it's not just one housing market, I guess. It's
exactly
one,
right. So
yeah.
Housing can be becomes a trickier conversation when we throw words like affordable into the discussion, because what does that mean, right? What does that look like? So to help with our conversation today, we've got a wonderful panel of experts, and so I want to introduce them. Greg Colburn is an assistant professor of real estate at the University of Washington's College of Built Environments. Greg entered academia after spending his first 17 years of his professional life in the private sector. At the UW, Greg enjoys teaching courses in housing economics and finance at both graduate and undergraduate levels. He maintains an active research agenda focused on housing policy, housing markets, housing affordability, and homelessness. Greg's also actively engaged in a wide range of community efforts to address the acute housing crisis in the Puget Sound region. Jennifer Lebrecq is currently the Director of Market Incentives, Land Use, and Sustainability at the Seattle Office of Housing. In that role, she oversees policies and programs that engage with the private sector to create affordable housing, represents affordable housing interests in local and regional planning efforts, and leads initiatives to decarbonize the affordable housing sector. She's been working in the field of affordable housing and community development for more than 20 years. Jennifer has a master's degree in public administration from the Everett School of Public Affairs at the UW. We've got a lot of UW people here today. I'm thinking we should have asked for some underwriting here. Maybe. No, I'll let it go. Ralph Black is currently the owner of Alliance Properties 2000. It's a Bellingham company that's been building single and multifamily projects for more than 30 years. He's served on the Whatcom County Affordable Housing Task Force, chairman of the Transfer of Development Rights Committee, chairman of the Emergency Services Funding Committee, and other community-based organizations. Ralph has a degree from Western in economics and political science. Yay for that. And has also helped us out on the Western Foundation Board, which we were very appreciative as well. Okay, so Hart, what are we going to ask these fine folks about housing?
Let me just say, first of all, I'm excited to have a chance to talk with this group. Housing is a huge topic, a huge part of the economy. Today, we're going to try to focus on affordability as the core issue, and that should let us talk about workforce housing and a variety of things. I don't think it's going to give us that we're going to have time to talk about topics like the push to move housing away from fossil fuels, the decarbonization that you mentioned, or homelessness, or some other things that are so important. But maybe, we'll see where the audience takes us with some of the questions. But to start, I want to ask what affordability means. How should we define it? And Greg, I'm going to start with you, then I'll go to Jennifer, and then Ralph. And I want you to feel free to think about affordability, whether you're thinking about home ownership or whether you're thinking about rental, because right, it's an easy word. It's probably got a simple definition in Webster's, but I think it's going to be hard. I'm just going to try to see if we're thinking about affordability in similar ways, or where it takes us. So, Greg, affordability, how do you define it?
Thanks, Hart. Appreciate it. It's funny, I'm actually writing a textbook on affordable housing as we speak. And I was flying back from LA yesterday and writing the introductory chapter, which is basically asking the question, what is affordability? And speaking to that, the complexity of that relatively simple question. You know, what's affordable for me is very different than what's affordable for Bill Gates, right? And so the household matters when we talk about affordability, and that complicates this. And so when we start to think about affordability writ large, we kind of have to say like, well, where are you living and what's your income, et cetera, et cetera. And so the most standard measure is what we call housing cost burden, which is if you spend more than 30% of your income towards housing, we would say that you're burdened, and above 50%, we would say you're severely cost burdened. And those are widely used, but they're imperfect measures. If you make $10 million a year and spend 30% of your income on housing, you're fine. You're fine. If you make $20,000 a year and are spending 30 or 50% of your income on housing, you have severely constrained your ability to consume other household goods and necessities. Therefore, housing cost burden is not a one size fits all. And so there have been other measures that scholars have looked at in terms of residual method, how much money is left over after you pay your housing, what kind of wage would you need to comfortably afford housing, et cetera. So there are all sorts of approaches there. That's not even getting into the difference between renters and homeowners, which is a radically different conversation. And I don't want to go too long here, but I typically focus on renters when I talk about affordability. I typically focus on low-income housing, and the vast majority of those folks are renters. The problem with looking at affordability with homeowners is we have incented through the federal tax system home ownership, and therefore your monthly mortgage payment is not just money out of your pocket. You actually get a tax deduction. And some of that money is being used to pay down principal. And so just saying that my mortgage payment is 30% of my income, therefore my burden is the same as a renter paying 30% of their income, is not necessarily a fair comparison. So we could spend a lot more time on that, but I won't. I will turn it back to the other panelists so I don't monopolize this conversation.
Jennifer, I'll jump into you with you.
All right, and I agree with what much of Greg has said, so I'll just add a little bit to it. I mean, I sit at the Seattle Office of Housing, where our mission is to create and preserve affordable housing opportunities. So I have probably a very particular perspective on this. I think of affordability and affordable housing as being housing that is built for and reserved for people with low incomes, where the rents really are restricted to be affordable and generally, as Greg said, to fit within that 30% definition. So where rents are calculated to be affordable so that someone is paying no more than 30% of their income towards rent. You know, just to place some context on that in terms of income, that would mean for a very low income household that's making $25,000 a year, that their rent to be affordable under that definition would have to be a little over $600. Someone's making $45,000 a year, their rent to be affordable would have to be about $1,100. So obviously not something, at least in the city of Seattle, that the market is currently able to provide just on its own. And I would agree also that the homeownership question and affordability is more nuanced, because homeownership does accrue all these other benefits in a way that rental housing does not. I think for homeownership, the affordability question is really, can a household afford it? Can they access a homeownership opportunity? I was just looking it up on Zillow. The median home price in Seattle is $934,000. If you look at someone who's at 80% of what we call area median income, which we generally think of as being sort of the cutoff for being low income, that would be a 3-person household making $100,000 would be considered at that 80% AMI. They could afford a home that's maybe between $300,000 to $400,000. So it's not even about like the housing payment and the size of the housing payment, but just about access at all, whether or not they're able to find that affordable homeownership opportunity on the market. And of course, when they do, we want it to be with a housing payment that is sustainable, that they can afford over time.
No, I want to come back to that point in just a little bit about what's the market providing, who can participate, and so on. So I think if you'll let me, I'm going to ask another question like on that shortly. Ralph, you're at a disadvantage having to follow that, but what can you add on sort of the meaning of affordability?
Not a lot. I think, you know, it's good we've made the differentiation between home ownership and rentals, because policies and solutions, I think, are different for those two. But I will say probably one thing I would add for affordability is we tend to, and I've noticed a little bit of the conversation right now, we tend to go to the lower income. We tend to go to, we tend to look at income levels. I look at affordability as a rising tide should raise all boats, you know, that we have families that may have income levels above where these minimum and where some of the programs are available, especially in rentals and stuff, but they don't qualify because their income is slightly above. And so affordability, I think, needs to look across the spectrum of real estate, not only at new construction. I know we'll be talking about a lot of that today, but as you probably have from your data, new construction is a very small sliver of the entire real estate market that's available. And so the question is, how do you move across the entire market and create affordability options?
And I appreciate that point, Ralph. And I think that that's right. If we always talk about affordability and affordable housing as a spectrum, there's needs from all the way from people exiting homelessness to home ownership opportunities. So we do want to think about it as a spectrum and acknowledge that there are different tools to address different parts of that spectrum.
Got it. So we often talk about things when they get to be a bit dire, right? And there have been a lot of articles about housing and how housing prices spiked with COVID. But I think it would be misleading if we really focused on COVID. So I want to back up. I don't think it was. I don't think we had a housing market where things were affordable across the spectrum and things were fine, and boom, COVID. The roots of the problem go back, right? And I want to explore that history just a little bit. So Jennifer, if I had you come into class to talk about housing affordability, what sort of timeline would you give, or what history would you paint for the students?
That's a great question. And I do agree with you. Certainly our affordable housing crisis did not start with COVID. I do think what the pandemic illustrated is how very essential having a safe, decent, stable place to live is, right? You literally could not be safe if you did not have a home. And I think that in a time when people had so much uncertainty around their income, it highlighted the importance of having that kind of safe, stable home. I think I'm a practitioner, not a professor, so this will not be a history lesson. But I think a couple contexts or pieces of information that I would share is first, in this country, the history of our housing policies is a history of racist policies, right? I mean, I really think you have to understand the history of housing policies that this country has passed over time, including things like redlining, to understand that what we see today. And, you know, when you look at housing data, who is cost burdened, who is homeless, who struggles to pay their rent, and where, you will see the disparate impacts by race and ethnicity. That is a history of that policy. So I think anyone who wants to understand housing in this country should understand that history. I would also add that we have seen just a real decline in federal resources and investment in housing over the past few decades. And that has placed an increasing amount of pressure on local jurisdictions, cities and towns and states to be able to support affordable housing production. And I don't think that's realistic, right? I don't think that states or cities or governments, city and towns are ever going to be able to provide the amount of investment that's really needed to sort of fully address and resolve the housing crisis that we have here today. And the final piece of context that I would add is that affordable housing and affordability is not a big city issue. You know, we hear about New York, we hear about LA, of course, we hear about Seattle, but really we're starting to see that affordability and affordable housing is a crisis across the country in all sorts of metropolitan areas and in rural areas as well. You know, I was just looking at some information today. There's an article from The Atlantic a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, that said that there's a sizable increase in the number of households spending half or more of their income, that cost burden that Greg talked about in rural counties across the country. And I think partly that's because of trends like not seeing enough supply and seeing rents and home prices increase much faster than incomes.
No, great.
Back to you.
Great comments. Greg, a similar sort of question. What picture would you paint to help a group of students understand housing affordability? but I'm going to cheat a little bit and get you to build on something that Jennifer was just saying. Just if possible, can you talk a little bit about whether the challenges or problems that are that we see in our region and that we're a little bit more aware of, are they the same in other parts of the country, or is there anything unique about the region?
Sure. Well, I will echo what Jennifer said. I actually have a paper that I'm working on with some colleagues right now that's under review, where we look at the dynamics of housing cost burden over the last 50 years. And we use a data set from the University of Michigan, which is pretty cool. And what's fascinating is that housing cost burden has, in essence, doubled over the last 50 years, from 1970 to 2020. The share of income that households are spending, renter households are spending on housing, has doubled, which is a dramatic increase. And when you decouple that fraction, the income and rent, what you see is, on an inflation adjusted basis, incomes for renter households have fallen 20% over that time period, and rents have gone up almost 30, 40, 50%. So this decoupling has put huge pressure on renter households, and that's what we're experiencing right now. So you're exactly right. This is not a COVID phenomenon. This is a 50-year phenomenon of lagging incomes and continually increased rental costs and home prices as well. From a regional standpoint, we certainly do have some unique factors in our region in terms of explosive job growth and well-compensated employees and lots of highly compensated imports, and a relatively inelastic housing supply, right? We have mountains and water. It makes it harder for us to sprawl and build more housing. And so that's clearly an issue here. But what's fascinating to me is that when you look at housing cost burden from jurisdiction to jurisdiction around the country, what you'll see is that income and housing markets move in tandem, right? There's a relationship there. My favorite statistic is that the housing cost burden in Detroit, Michigan is higher than San Francisco, California. And people say that can't be right, because the housing costs in Detroit are incredibly cheap. They're tearing down housing. They have way too much housing, but their incomes are terribly low. Incomes in San Francisco are really high. And so actually the burdens for residents of Detroit are greater. And so we think about a housing crisis in Seattle, San Francisco, and New York, when in fact there's housing crises all over the place, because we see that housing costs adjust to what the level of income is. And so clearly housing is not affordable in Seattle, even for the graduates from Western and UW, and then the folks that I work with. They're terribly concerned about their ability to live here. But it's not like there are a lot of other places where it's easy, right? The reality is burdens exist all over the country.
If you want to live there, it's going to be a problem. And I'm going to cheat and hint of half of an audience question about, because you mentioned that income and housing move together. Are you worried that we're seeing, especially with some of the hybrid work or people from out of region, so a Bellingham, for example, somebody from Seattle or San Francisco might be buying homes here and renting them out for a little bit because they're not ready to retire. But I'm hearing more and more people talk about there's a new disconnect between incomes in an area and home prices. So do you feel pretty confident that things are going to continue to move together, or is that breaking down?
Is that for me or for?
Yeah, no, go ahead, Greg. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think they move together in the wrong direction, right? In the sense that we certainly have seen over 50 years of decoupling, in the sense that inflation adjusted incomes have lagged while rents have gone up. And so I would have to correct what I say in the sense that there's a perfect pairing there. I think, so I'm going to Boise next week. I got invited to spend 2 days in Boise because I talk a lot about homelessness and housing precarity, and they are scared to death in Boise. Right, their rents have skyrocketed because people leaving Silicon Valley, and that is having a huge impact on their housing market. And unless they get out ahead of this problem, they're going to start to see many of the problems that we see in places like Seattle and San Francisco. And so I do think for locations like Bellingham, as people locate there, incomes go up. You are going to see, if housing lags from a production standpoint, we're going to see huge increases in housing costs, and that's going to exact a significant toll on existing residents who are saying, what's going on here? So it's a real concern for mid-sized cities, especially in the Western United States, that are destination spots.
Okay, Ralph, picking up on a couple of things that both Greg and Jennifer have said. Is there something about our region that makes the affordability puzzle a little bit more challenging? And I'm going to let you ramble. You might want to mention, are there unique permitting or regulatory requirements? Does the Growth Management Act play in a different way? Or are those just details and every place has their version of those details? So is there something unique about our region?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. I do want to chime in on something that Greg said real quick.
Sure.
And I think Jennifer, and I did not quite hear it within the conversation. If I missed it, please excuse me. And that is, and we're seeing it here in the city of Bellingham, is it tends to be as higher income individuals have moved in and driven up prices, a lot of our affordability product has moved outside of the city into counties, smaller rural towns where they are producing products at a significantly lower market than what we have here in Bellingham, and continue to do so. And that's a whole nother conversation, the old drive till you qualify thing that used to be around forever. But it is a dynamic. I see it in Seattle as well, as it's pushing people further and further out. But I think it's an important dynamic to understand that as housing prices rise, people that have the mobility capability seem to move out to where they can find something they qualify. So I just wanted to digress for a second there, Hart. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
But back to your question, I don't think we're unique in Whatcom County. I think the same regulatory burden that drives up housing costs is from federal, state, and local levels we have here. Similar to Seattle, maybe in some degree, we have some just geographical constraints as to how big we can build. As I think Greg pointed out, we got the water on one side, the mountains on the other. So and when we go south, we got more mountains. So our only expansion capability is really north. Governmentally wise, we maybe have, and I'm not familiar with Seattle, so I'm going to speak strictly to Whatcom County, Bellingham. So I ask for your indulgence up front. We have a very strong anti-sprawl movement in Bellingham. And so the city does not want to push out its city limits. And even though urban boundary limits may be further and the land supply may look larger, but if you're not prepared to move public services into other areas, you're not able to bring that particular product online. A piece of land without sewer and water and power is not buildable in terms of the model we're talking about. So I don't think we're unique. I got into this game 20 plus years ago. The very first project I did, one of the issues in front of council was affordability. So this is 25, 27 years ago on the first one. And we still had the same discussions. We actually produced, in conjunction working with the city, some affordable units by their definition, which today's price seems almost ridiculous, how cheap it was. But I don't think we're unique in that, in our area at all.
All right.
Art,
Ralph,
can I just follow up on that for just one
yeah,
second?
Of course.
I
Yeah.
think this is a really important point that Ralph raises, which is the constraints around developing housing in local cities is a challenge. One of my favorite statistics is Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, which is Charlotte, North Carolina, has grown as fast, if not faster, than King County, Washington over the last decade. The amount of housing they have built during that time period is unbelievable. And if you look at their rents and their vacancy rates, their rents are far lower and their vacancy rates are still above 5%. And so in essence, they have been able to build enough to accommodate this rapid growth. So it's not just population growth that's the problem. It's a lack of a supply response. Now, they have some advantages we don't have in terms of the regulatory framework and topography. But the point is it can be done. And there are places that are doing that. We just have not been able to do that particularly on the West Coast over the last decade.
My family lives in Mecklenburg County, so I'll give them a shout out. Ralph, I'm going to stay with you. And we were on a task force years ago to try to identify steps Bellingham and Whatcom County could take to make housing more affordable. Can you reflect on that and share some of the things that the task force recommended? Comment a little bit on whether some of those things were put in place or not. And I guess really I'm asking, building on what Greg just said, why do you think the problem of affordability, or what you were just talking about in terms of how long you've been doing this, why do you think the problem of affordability has gotten worse since then, not better? And then Jennifer, start thinking. I'm going to ask you a similar question in just a moment.
And then therefore, additionally, to beg your endurance, Greg and I must have this thing going back and forth. So I want to follow in on his last comment as well. And I do agree with it. But I want to add an additional amendment to it, if I might. And that is, even if the cities were to expand their boundaries, add another distance that became development for development, the time associated from beginning of this project till the first shovel in the ground has become so onerous and so lengthy that it is almost, you are unable to react to the market forces. Give you an example. I'm sitting in an office in our project here on King Mountain. From the first day I walked in for this project till the first shovel went in the ground was 14 years. We're working on an extension of this project. We're well into 5 or 6 years, and we still don't have the first shovel in the ground. And so what you're looking at is your inability to rapidly respond to these market dynamics. And as Greg and Jennifer might attest to, as these populations increase, not only do you have to have the land supply to build, but it has to be ready to build on. It can't simply, you can't start the process when people show up. And so I just want to get that in. Regarding chat, was a long, fun process. You go to the city's website of the chat, top 5 recommendations.
And chat was the County Housing Affordability Task Force.
Correct. County Housing Affordability, consisting of stakeholders, private and public sector. A couple of years, if I recall, wasn't it hard? Year and a half, 2 years, something like that. We met. It was a long time with officials. Of the top 5 recommendations, if you go to the City of Bellingham's website, the city has tried to address some of them. One is through an infill toolkit process, which still doesn't quite work right. The other is EDI process, economic development funds for infrastructure, which is one of the chat's recommendations. The short answer from the private sector is no, not really. Any of our key recommendations have not been put through, and there really isn't anything from the chat recommendations that have been impacting the city or impacting the construction industry. The same issues that we discussed at the chat meeting are still in effect.
Right, so that we have an audience question that I'll paraphrase. Right, it said, "Great, you can keep describing the problem all day long. How are we going to make some progress?" So I'm going to switch, Jennifer, and I'm going to ask. There are a lot of programs designed to create affordable housing, and we seem to keep falling behind. From a policy perspective, what's working? And then what are some of the challenges to, I'm going to try to keep from going back to build and Mecklenburg and be a little bit more nuanced. So
yeah. Well, it's not my answer might be some version of build, but it will be a little more nuanced. So I would say first, I do want to make this distinction. I think this conversation about general affordability is really important. And I do think that absolutely having supply and demand match is essential to solving some of our affordability problems. And I want to be clear that it's not just a supply and demand problem. There will be low-income households who will never be able to, that the private market will never be able to serve, no matter how much housing we produce. So I'm thinking about, that person working minimum wage who makes $25,000 a year or less, or that senior whose only source of income is Social Security. The private market is probably never going to serve that household. And so that's really where this idea of affordable housing comes in. We need to build housing and maintain housing for households with low incomes that will be affordable to them. And I think that we really do have proven policy solutions to be able to do that. I'll name one of them. In the city of Seattle, we have a housing levy. City of Seattle voters have, since 1981, Seattle voters have approved 1 bond and then 5 levies to create affordable housing for low-income households. through the last 40 years, we've created 15,000 city-funded affordable rental units that, as of the last time we took a look recently, are serving 26,000 people in the city of Seattle. So it is possible for local jurisdictions to have the political will and to create the resources to produce affordable housing. Is that going to solve the entire enormous need? No, it's not. I want to be clear on that, but it is still making an important and meaningful and significant contribution to meeting the needs of low-income households. And so I do think it's possible. In some ways, we like to say the solution to homelessness is housing. I mean, it's not complicated. It's like we need housing across the spectrum, and we need to create housing specifically for low-income households. What's complicated is that takes an enormous amount of resources to build, and not just to build, but especially for certain types of housing to maintain in good condition over time. And it's really that resource part that's so hard, because I think that we're talking really about, just in Seattle itself, billions and billions of dollars to be able to do that. And that's the part that feels, I think, challenging and like just an enormous undertaking. But certainly we can do it, and we have done it, and we just need to do more of it.
I mean, so you mentioned having supply and demand match, and we know that means different things for people in different income levels, especially those that really can't participate in market-based housing. So I think I'm headed to some questions about, are markets giving us what we want, or are some communities having to step up and say, this is what we want to look like, and how are we going to make that happen if it may not be just sort of a market result. But I'm going to get there with an audience question, and I'll start by asking Ralph first, then Greg. Should I buy a house now, or should I wait for prices to drop? I've just moved to the area, new job. Is now a good time to buy?
Oh, the realtor me says it's always a good time to buy hard. There's no such thing as a bad time to buy. But that question actually, I think, cuts to several things that Greg and Jennifer have talked about, and that is, in particular, in the home ownership market, there are a number of factors that are outside just the income. If this person has the financial qualifications, if they plan to be here for an extended period of time, something beyond a year, to 2 years, then odds are buying is a good idea. Trying to judge the peaks and the valleys of the market are people that are much above my pay grade, are much better at it than I am. I think you're going to see a little bit of a market adjustment, but nothing like what happened coming out of the real estate depression and coming out of the 6, 7, 8 years, where the banks took back so many units and had to just get rid of those units. And so there were gigantic price discounts just to get rid, because it was very much a finance-based, huge interjection of supply into the market, causing prices to go way down. I don't think we're going to see that here. And so the short answer would be, get your timing right. If you've got something that in a neighborhood you're comfortable with, in a price bracket and a monthly payment you're comfortable with, I think purchase is a good idea.
Greg, want to add to that, or kind of telling me he's crazy, or?
No, I'm not going to say anyone is crazy if they want to buy a house. I am not in the business of telling people whether to buy a house or Amazon stock or 10-year treasuries. Because the reality is, if the question is being asked, will this asset appreciate over the next couple of years? I have no idea. And the reality, a lot of forces are going to impact that. And then you need to start thinking about, well, is this better than other opportunities in other capital markets, bonds, stocks, whatever the case may be? And so I think that's outside of my area of expertise. I would say that home ownership provides a number of benefits, as Ralph indicated. And if you plan on being in that residence for a period of time, and that's a place that you want to live, and you want to have a forced saving mechanism and potentially build equity over an extended period of time, buy the house. Absolutely. If it's within your means to do so. I own a house. I think it's great. It's not for everyone. If you are looking at this as let's take advantage of home prices as they fall and hopefully make a quick buck over the next couple of years, there's probably other asset classes that I would go to do that, because the transaction costs of buying and selling homes are significant, far more so than buying a few shares of Amazon or Microsoft or whatever stock is down right now.
No, that's a great comment, because I was thinking about it completely as housing and long term. I was not thinking about should I buy a house if I'm thinking about short-term valuation changes and specific timing. So great comments. So Greg, back to the comments about matching supply and demand. You mentioned Mecklenburg County, the need to build a little bit, but can you just in general comment on whether you think markets are working? And I guess I really want to say, if you have somebody say the high prices, the high rents, the homelessness is a clear sign that housing markets are just all messed up. If you had someone say that to you, how would you respond?
Well, I would say I recently wrote a book about homelessness and really use a market-based perspective to explain regional rates of homelessness. And I spent the first 17 years of my life in the capital markets, and so I'm familiar with the markets, and I think the markets do really good things. One of my favorite scholars is a guy named Charles Lindblom, who was an economist, and he actually had a dual appointment in political science and economics at Yale. And he wrote all these books about the relationship between the public sector and markets. And his point was that a market is like a tool, and a tool can work really well for one thing and not real well for something else. And it doesn't mean it's a bad tool. It means it's a screwdriver. If you try to use a screwdriver to hammer a nail, it's not going to work that well. And so the point is like, it's not a normative statement. Markets aren't good or bad. It's what I was in LA yesterday speaking to real estate leaders. I've never seen a pro forma development project that makes sense for people who can't afford to pay any rent. And everyone laughed. And I said, if you have one, I'd love to see it, because we could use a lot of that. So the point is that using markets to provide housing for people who don't have any income doesn't work. It doesn't mean markets are bad. It just is a square peg in a round hole. And so that's why when I talk about this, we need all sectors of society, the private sector, private market developers like Ralph, to build a whole bunch of housing. We need nonprofit developers. I'm on the board of one here in Seattle that uses tax credits to build affordable housing. We got to do that. And then we need the public sector. We need to give the public sector the resources that we need to allow Jennifer and her colleagues to build the housing that we need for folks who have limited incomes. And so there's not one silver bullet. The private market alone won't do this, and just subsidy for low-income households won't only do it. We need all of it. And because we're so far behind right now, when people say, well, which one do you want, Greg? My answer is always D, all the above. It's like an exam question. We need all of it.
I could chime in.
Second that.
Yeah.
Yes.
If I could chime in for a second too, Hart, on Greg's response. I think, and Jennifer talked about this briefly, and as we start trying to bring these forces of supply and demand in place to achieve some of these goals, especially for the low income part of the market, it's going to end up being a public-private partnership. There's been a lot of discussion about the cost at which a public agency can deliver a unit, all the way back to our countywide affordable task force, as to what level can a pure public sector deliver a unit, and what level can a pure private sector deliver a unit. And I think you're going to look, especially on some of this multi-housing, at the need for combined partnerships, public-private. You're going to have to look at situations in response to how do we get there. You're going to have to look at situations. We've got to reduce this regulatory burden that is weighing the system down and making it just move at glacial speed. I mean, we have to get through this system and identify that we're starting, as Greg has indicated, from so far behind that we're going to have to sprint, not walk, to even get to the starting line. And we're not going to be able to do that under the existing system that we have regulatorily moving forward. It's going to have to be a public priority, and they're going to have to look both Fed, state, and local at the burdens that reduce this, and get the ability to deliver not only market rate housing, but affordable units for people that need it, that are workers. We're trying to work local, and speak locally again. We're working with the city and some groups I won't necessarily, to provide sites and stuff. And we're every time we turn, we're running into some regulatory roadblock that says, well, no, we can't do that. Or yes, we can do that. Or no, we can't. And the timelines just keep getting longer and longer and longer. And the crisis is now. And you're going to have to cut through some of this regulatory issues if you're going to try to get, as Greg has indicated, get us to the starting line and get us even in the race to try to catch up, let alone ever catch up.
So the public-private partnership, suppose we go back to Jennifer's comment about the housing levy and some of the city-funded affordable housing projects. Jennifer, what do you say to somebody who comes up and goes, oh, great, though, but doesn't taxing affordable housing make housing in general less affordable? Isn't that a race to the bottom?
I think that's a great question. You know, we always balance that when we're thinking about the housing levy. It's, you know, it's been approved by Seattle voters since 1980. So I think we've always struck the right balance where, you know, we want to be able to invest in the opportunity for people to be able to stay in their homes in their neighborhood. And I think it goes back to exactly what Greg said, where there's no one solution. No one's suggesting that we solve the entire affordable housing crisis through, for example, the housing levy, but we need a lot of different tools. And frankly, we need a lot of different sources of funds to be able to make those public investments in affordable housing. So I think it's being thoughtful about how we do that and about how we do that with progressive revenue sources, right? I mean, that's definitely part of the affordable housing conversation right now, is how do we create more resources in a way that doesn't use regressive sort of tax systems, but also starts to think about progressive revenue as well.
You mean addressing some of this is not going to be free? And we have to.
Yeah, no, it turns out it's not.
But also, Hart, we need to look a little beyond the traditional models, and some of what Jennifer's talking about and Greg are the traditional models, right? Where we raise these funds and then we go out and we try and buy a piece of land, publicly buys a piece of land and try and goes through that whole process. I drive back to the cost per unit to the end user, to the person who's going to live in this apartment or live in this condo unit. And you go back and say, well, what would a public-private venture look like? Well, instead of taking tens of millions of dollars, let's say, and buying the land and building the building and going through the whole process that a private sector person does, maybe you make a partnership and you become the master renter of the entire building that the private sector built. And now you take all that money that you would have had to have done for buying land and building the building and use it to subsidize the rent down over a much longer period of time for the people that live in that building, but you let the private sector deliver the building at optimal cost.
I think that's a fair point. And I would say, Ralph, also, you know, when we think about the cost to produce housing, especially when the public sector is doing it, or when we have projects that have public investments, you know, we're working sometimes under conditions that the private sector is not. For example, we do pay a minimum of residential prevailing wage on all our projects. So, you know, we've committed to sort of a minimum standard for wages. We often have quite a, you know, there's a lot of community outreach that happens and a lot of community review that can add time and cost, as well as I think often building to a really high standard to be able to sort of proactively address neighborhood concerns. So it's not always an apples to apples comparison on cost because of some of the additional factors that go into creating affordable housing. But I do agree. I mean, I think it goes back to Greg's point. We just kind of need all the hammers swinging at the same time and a lot of creative ideas and models about how to get there. And the private sector is a really important partner.
And Jennifer, I do agree with you. I guess I just want to drive back to the concern of getting the number of units out there right now to get people involved. And I do agree. And this issue was raised at our Affordable Housing Task Force. Many of the groups that do what you do, it's much more beyond the sticks and bricks of the building. And I think that needs to be recognized, and I recognize it. Flipping that around, I also say, but you need to get the sticks and bricks put up there at the most cost-effective method. And if you are constrained on your funding from having to pay prevailing wage or whatever these may be, you look at a private sector project that hasn't got those same constraints that allows you to deliver more units and hopefully gives you more funds for these other things that I think are very important that groups like yourself does.
All right, slight change. Craig, in your research, have you found that Airbnb, just short-term rentals in general have taken housing out of the market for longer-term rentals, workforce housing, and the like? Or is that just an easy thing to shoot at, if you will?
Yeah, I haven't conducted specific research on that, Hart, so I have to plead ignorance on that. I've certainly done some reading on it. When I talk to people in San Francisco and they blame Airbnb, I say, listen, your issues are far greater than Airbnb. Might they be contributing to this issue? Certainly. But if Airbnb went away tomorrow, you still have a massive housing crisis. So in terms of order of magnitude, that would not be the number one on my list in terms of policy action. Is it contributing to scarcity? It certainly might be. And so around the edges, might that be positive to think about that? But generally speaking, the massive shortfall, the housing scarcity that we have in these coastal cities, that keeps me up at night more than Airbnb does.
I imagine, Greg, that answer might depend too on location. Like I would imagine that perhaps some areas that are more like vacation oriented would be impacted more by that.
No question.
Yeah.
And Ralph, in a similar sort of vein, if I say, go build me some accessory dwelling units, are ADUs a way to address some of this? Or is that also just a hot button issue because it's easy to talk about, but just much more marginal around the fringes and not that big?
Well, there again, I'm going to speak locally, and ADUs, at least locally, are a big hot potato political issue, and the city has wrestled with it quite a bit and have put regulations in place that don't make it readily available. Same thing as out at Western, you may recall, Hart, when there was a whole push, all that student housing, all those rentals around the university were being, a lot of students were getting them, and the neighborhoods got upset with parking. And so those city passed an ordinance, and no longer those units could have 6, 8, 10 students living in them, right? So they had to go out and find rentals somewhere. Regarding ADUs, I think it is certainly, it serves two purposes, and it needs to be much more flexible. I think it certainly helps not only to provide additional housing that's needed, housing stock until other housing stock is available, primarily, for singles, a lot of time do the ADUs, but it's also was a way, as Airbnbs are, by the way, some of them are used, to provide subsidies for the mortgage payment for the family that owns the unit. And so they're able to rent out an ADU, which would then allow them to not spend as much of their gross income on the house, because they were getting some revenue from it. Same thing with Airbnbs. I mean, there's a classic Airbnb model where people are buying it and the product is being funded and strictly by the Airbnb. But there is also, as housing prices increase, there's a whole group of people that actually rent their houses or rent their units on short-term Airbnbs and use that revenue to also subsidize, they don't do it every month, they do it for 2 days a month or something, to subsidize their mortgage payment. But getting back to the root of your question, I think there's a whole series of housing types that could help, but you have to have that flexibility to provide it.
And I think that's a good point, Ralph. I mean, one thing we haven't talked a lot about in this conversation is zoning and that's where I think the ADU conversation is really interesting. I mean, even if we knocked it out of the park with ADUs, we're not going to solve the housing crisis with ADUs, but it does, I think, open the conversation to how does zoning, especially zoning in certain, where we have really limited density, how does that impact what the solutions that we have are that are available? And I think that when we talk about ADUs, we're really talking, we're opening the door to a wider conversation about zoning and what we need to do in order to create more opportunities for housing.
Yeah, you mean it's nuanced. So there's a whole lot of the audience has gotten active all of a sudden. As we're running out of time, I now have a flood of questions coming in. And I want to give each of you a chance first. I can go back to some of these questions, but whether it's how do you measure success, what would you like to see next? I want to give each of you a chance to have a closing comment. What do you want the audience to take away from this? And Greg, or if anybody wants to jump in, but otherwise I'll go Greg and then Jennifer and then Ralph.
I was hoping you go last. No, I'm
Well,
I'm joking. What would I want people to take away is the housing crisis in our communities is something that we have all created, right, over the last generations. And so we collectively own this. And so this is going to require all hands on deck to be involved. One of the challenges around housing is it's deeply emotional and personal. And we see this in the local politics around the construction of housing. And so we see a lot of people who say housing is way too expensive, but when it comes time to build a multifamily development in their neighborhood, they say no way. Right. And that to me is a fundamental challenge. I firmly believe that the built environment in the Puget Sound region has to change, and it will change. And it will either change with people kicking and screaming, or it will happen with people behaving in a more graceful way. We cannot accommodate all the people who want to live from Bellingham down to Tacoma over the next 50 years with our existing land use. It will not work. And so ultimately, this will become a denser region from a built environment standpoint. And that may excite some people and it may anger some people. And that's just the reality. And I hope that we can do that with some grace, because ultimately, if we don't make those land use changes and create more housing for folks, the people who are getting paid a lot of money to move in here are going to be fine. They have the resources. It's the people who've been here for decades and generations who suffer if we don't build the housing. And so it's absolutely essential. And it may come time when all of a sudden there's going to be a new development in your neighborhood and you're going to have a decision to make, which is, do I protest this development, or I say, no, this is something that we need to do as a community? And I hope the answer is accepting that change that's inevitable.
Jennifer, a takeaway message for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think the scale of need, especially when we look at affordable housing for low-income households, is enormous. I'm working on on a countywide planning process right now where we've estimated that we'll need close to 200,000 units in the next 25 years, so that no low-income household is cost burden. No one's paying more than 30% of their rent or their income towards rent. And I think when we face numbers like that, we can feel like that it's not worth doing anything because we don't know how we're going to get there, right? And I think that's not acceptable. Every time we create an affordable housing project, we create housing that is affordable to a household who lives here, and they can afford to stay in their community and in their neighborhood, and they can afford their housing and their food and all their other necessities, and they're providing stability for their family and their kids. And so I don't think inaction is acceptable just because the problem is really big. I think we need to focus on what is within our control, what we can do, and then we need to advocate hard for other resources, including at the federal level. So I say, let's keep going, and let's not use the scope and magnitude of the problem as an excuse not to do anything.
And we had an audience person wanting to talk about how do you increase the role of federal programs, or to get more federal resources in. So I wish we had more time on that. Ralph, it's clearly your problem. You're not building enough. But other than that, a last comment for the audience?
Someone once said that at a meeting, and I said, of a number of builders that were in the room, that said, you guys just aren't building enough units. And I piped up as the representative and said, do you think there are any people sitting around this table that are more highly motivated to build units than all the builders in this room? I said, we are motivated beyond what you can possibly imagine. It is not for lack of wanting to do it. It's the system that's preventing it. And I chime in I really appreciate what both Greg and Jennifer had said. And I think if there's a takeaway that I would like to have the audience and even some of the people that are participating, is that this cannot continue, in my opinion, to be this ongoing adversarial role between the builder developer and the public, or the political forces. And the adversarialness has gotten worse as I've been in this business, in this sort of the regulations and the regulatory have all been sort of based on this adversarial role between the builders, developers, and the political forces and the staff. And I think if we're going to address this problem, we need to be able to sit down around a table and say, look, how do we deliver these units? We know the numbers we need to hit. You know the number of units we need to do. We've got to shorten this process. We've got to make this process work for both sides. Or quite frankly, as Greg has said, it's going to continue the status quo right now for the next decade again. And you think we have a problem now? Wait till the next decade problem comes in and we keep adding more people on top of what we already have.
So Greg's comment about how do we do this with grace? James, are we getting the hook?
You're getting the hook, but man, what a great conversation. I thank you, Greg, Jennifer, Ralph. This was truly a gift. And I thank you all for all of your wonderful thoughts. I want to thank the audience for joining us today for Western Insights. This and previous Western Insight sessions are all available online. That's middle of the night. You want to catch up on some backstories of Western Insights. You just hit our website up and you can pull those down and check those out. We will be sending you an email shortly with a link to those sessions, so it's easy to find, further resources from our panel, and also an invitation to give your feedback on this session. From all of us at Western Washington University and the College of Business and Economics, we want to thank you for being here today. We also want to thank the Western Alumni Association and the Western Foundation for their support of this series. And we know that they would like us to thank you for those of you who chose to support the university as part of this effort as well. Everyone have a fantastic rest of the week. We're in for some wild weather coming up in the days ahead. So buckle down and thank you for coming today.